a large dose of mercury on having their amalgams removed unless they use the techniques that prevent them from breathing the mercury vapor that's being generated during the removal. I've been in this mercury fight, and I didn't consider it a fight when I first started. I had no dog in the fight to speak of, but I did do research on Alzheimer's disease and found that mercury would mimic many of the biochemical aberrancies that we see in Alzheimer's disease. By treating it into rats exposed to mercury vapor, or taking normal brain and treating it with mercury, we could create biochemistry that looked very similar to what we see in Alzheimer's disease. So at the very least, you could say that if mercury weren't causal, at least it would be an exacerbating factor for these diseases. Recent research that's come out has supported my concept that mercury is probably fundamentally involved in Alzheimer's disease. I don't think there's much doubt about that. This is not popular with the American Dental Association and even perhaps our Food and Drug Administration dental branch. And you cannot get support for any studies showing that mercury is involved in causation of any neurological disease. The people who fund American research, and this is easy to check out, just go to the literature, almost all the papers that talk about mercury being toxic, neurotoxic, will be submitted from foreign countries. It's been very difficult for me. I used to be highly funded from NIH, but when I started working on mercury and mercury neurotoxicity, I essentially lost all my NIH funding. I would say that the research we've done with autism has been very telling, and yet I have yet to be called in by anybody to say, tell us why you think this is the problem. Just recently, we now have an FDA committee that's evaluating amalgams for safety. They did call me in, and we had the Institute of Medicine study on autism, and they did call me in to testify. But other than that, there is not much work. You won't find any national conference in the United States looking at the possibility that mercury might be involved in any of our neurological diseases. And this is critically important because you understand Alzheimer's disease, autism, ALS, MS, Parkinson's are all major diseases that we haven't a clue about what caused them. We have no absolute proof. And it's not because we can't intellectually figure that out. It's because we are not given the funding to pursue the fact that maybe heavy metal toxicity, predominantly mercury toxicity, is the cause of these illnesses. What I think is really critical is that we look at the country of Sweden, which has decided to abolish the use of amalgam fillings. The state government will put in composite fillings. They'll even replace your amalgam fillings for free, but they won't pay for amalgam fillings anymore. And if you look at the studies done in Sweden where they have taken patients and they have looked at their health records, over 700 patients, they very carefully, using all of the safety factors that they could come up with, remove the amalgam so that the patient would not be exposed to the bolus dose or the large dose of mercury that they would be if they removed them with no care or no precautions taken. And then 3 years later, check them again and have them evaluate how their own health is. You see that these people, 70% of them, say they've had major improvement in their health. And what this is saying is that removing amalgams does make the population in general healthy. And when the ADA says there's no correlation between amalgam placement, amalgam existing in your mouth, and poor health, they're just ignoring the literature that they don't want to look at. The Swedes have done a tremendous job in this area. And because our National Institutes of Dental Research, avoid doing this type of research, it doesn't prove that amalgams aren't causing harm. I mean, absence of proof isn't proof of absence, and this is what they're depending on. They will tell you constantly there are no epidemiological studies showing amalgams cause any problem because none have been done. Because most likely the only country that could really afford to do this effectively would be the United States through the NIH, and they have not done these studies. And this comes after several meetings, that are now more than 10 years old, where the dental branch of the FDA said we need more studies to determine whether or not amalgams are safe. And even though they say we need more studies, they have yet to even start one, with regard to people who are aged. They do have a child study where they're putting mercury in the mouths of children. I would think that they should be very critical, and they're using blood levels of mercury and urine levels of mercury to decide exposure, etc. And what our research on the autistic children shows that means nothing. I mean, children that can't excrete mercury will have low urine, low blood levels, and it will indicate that they are not exposed when indeed they are the ones that are the most susceptible. And I would suggest to people who are learned, go back and look at the Shishil's study, where they looked at mercury in children, in an island where they primarily ate fish. Look at the Faroe Island studies in the North Sea, where they again looked at children who had primarily a diet of fish and whale. And what you will see is that the children with the lowest mercury levels in their hair and blood in those studies were the ones that were the most adversely affected, whereas the children with the highest level in their hair and blood were the ones that were the least affected. What this means is that the children who are effectively excreting the mercury, are getting better and are not getting sick, whereas the children who can't excrete it are the ones that are having medical problems and neurological problems.
Well, I spent close to 3 years working for the House Committee on Government Reform and its Subcommittee on Human Rights and Wellness. A major part of my activities during this time was investigating mercury in the human body, how it got there, what some of the effects were, and attempting to get our federal health agencies to talk about science and facts. And it ended up being a much more frustrating task than I ever would have imagined. We would have hearings, invite esteemed scientists in, such as Dr. Boyd Haley, who's a full professor and chair of the chemistry department at the University of Kentucky. And he would come in with solid science, properly annotated, peer-reviewed, very believable. The folks from the federal health agencies would come in and tell anecdotes saying, well, we haven't seen any problems for about 150 years. If there was a problem, surely it would show up. And they'd say silly things like, we don't see any people getting sick when amalgams are installed in their mouth. Well, of course not. The mercury from the amalgams bioaccumulates. It takes time. As it continues to accumulate in the fatty tissues of the body, particularly in the brain, the adverse effects come on gradually for most people, unless they're particularly sensitive. Begins with a few point decline in IQ. It can be attention deficit disorder, ADHD, full-blown autism, early onset Alzheimer's. And no, these things don't happen as the patient is walking out of the dentist's office. And unfortunately, our doctors also are not trained to look in somebody's mouth when they're diagnosing some of these diseases. They don't look in the mouth when they're dealing with these syndromes such as lupus, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue. But they should, because there's a growing body of scientific evidence that indicates that there is a very distinct connection between the mercury that's constantly vaporizing with every breath a person takes and these undiagnosed syndromes. Another thing that I found very disturbing on the part of the federal agencies is they've come up with these calculations of body burden, what's acceptable and what isn't acceptable as far as the amount of mercury in the body. And they would always presume that babies are born pristine. There was absolutely no mercury on day one. And that's foolishness. When mothers eat fish, when mothers breathe pollution that contains some mercury, especially when mothers have mercury-containing amalgams in their teeth, they pass a lot of that along to the baby through the placenta. It's concentrated about 9-fold into these tiny little bodies. And when the brain and the neurological system is forming, that's when the most damage occurs. So these measurements, these estimates of body burden that all assume, well, there's no mercury in that child until they get their first vaccination, that's bunk. And the feds know it's bunk. But they still put out that propaganda. Then they do some really strange things with their mathematics. They calculate what they think is a acceptable body burden and they'll calculate how much is in a given shot, how much mercury from the thimerosal in a given shot. Then they'll divide it by something like 180, and it's as if they think that this material is getting into the babies and young children as a slow drip over 180 days' time. And that averages out okay. It doesn't come over a frightening threshold. Well, how silly can you get? It doesn't go into the kids through a gradual drip. It goes in all at once with a jab, with a shot, and puts these kids well over even the most conservative thresholds for the danger point. We have our Environmental Protection Agency spending hundreds of millions of dollars studying pollution issues, and mercury is one of the big issues. Forcing industry, especially the smokestack industries and the mining, to spend billions of dollars trying to correct their mercury problem. But they totally ignore, or almost totally ignore, the dental offices. And in jurisdiction after jurisdiction, in place after place, by far, the biggest burden of mercury that's going into our water tables, our water supply, is coming from the dental offices. Now, why won't the feds look at that? Well, my theory is funding, money. You can go to Congress, and you can get hundreds of millions of dollars appropriated to work with the smokestack industries and with mining. You can't get that kind of funding to deal with dental offices, and therefore the feds don't go after it. They want the big bucks. Whether it's the pharmaceutical industry, the dental industry, the federal agencies, they're all looking for their form of funding. It's all about money. An oversight in these investigations is so glaring that it seems to me it must be intentional. I mean, these federal doctors and scientists can't possibly be this stupid. They always measure the toxicities as a standalone thing. When they're trying to measure mercury, they're trying to calculate whether it does or doesn't do damage. They act as if mercury is the only substance in the gut, or the only substance in the bloodstream. And that's just plain silly. There's a whole mishmash of other things in our digestive tract and in our bloodstream at any given time. And some of the synergies are devastating. Take lead, for instance. That's been well publicized over decades. We all know that lead can be devastating to people. We all know that young folks in the inner city are far more susceptible to damage from lead than the general population. Except now, of course, there's here in the East Coast, in the Washington metropolitan area, there's quite a scare about lead in the water supply at many times the rate they previously thought. But put lead and mercury both in the bloodstream at the same time, and you have a devastating synergy. 1 and 1 isn't 2. It's not an addition here. It's a multiplication. In this case, lead plus mercury, 1 plus 1 equals 100, at least. So we have a medical system where people that need help getting their fillings, they get mercury in their mouth, or they get nothing. This is the same population that's getting lead in their drinking water, lead from older apartments and houses, and the effect on some children is absolutely devastating, and the cost to society is more than we can measure. Now, a lot of the federal health officials seem to put a great stock in the Journal of the American Dental Association and in the papers that come out of the American Dental Association. They treat them with the deference or the reverence as if this is a professional association. But it's not. It's a trade association. Their journal is not a scientific, peer-reviewed journal. It's a trade journal. And there was many years in which the American Dental Association, or to be more correct, one of its subsidiaries, owned the patents on the 2 best-selling amalgam mixtures. So there was a financial interest in every filling that was put in the mouth of Americans. Well, during the time they owned that patent, more and more and more impartial scientists came out with the findings that, wait a minute, this mercury leaches for as much as 50 years while in these amalgams. And a good part of the fumes get into the human brain. Well, there was a financial interest on the part of the ADA to poo-poo that for a good long while. And then when it reached the point where even they surely had to know, they had to know that harm was being caused, it was too late. The incorrect information had been put out there for so many years, it was just impossible for them to change their stories. There have been efforts to give them a graceful escape route, such as let's think of the environment, let's think of the water table, let's stop dumping that mercury down the drain and harming the environment. But so far, organized dentistry has chosen not to accept the graceful way out. They're still putting mercury in our mouths to the tune of about 100 million fillings every year. Golden rule that we're taught throughout life is to do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But in Washington, D.C., that's changed. The golden rule is he who has the gold rules.
Some people might question that the smoke we see coming off the amalgam filling might not actually be mercury.